Here outside the Church of San Gregorio in Rome, we are reminded that all our wealth and possessions, in the end, are not our own. God has entrusted them to us as stewards so that we can put them to good use and share them with those in need. The 6th century Pope St. Gregory the Great resided on these grounds and exemplified this Catholic social ethic. Gregory came from a wealthy aristocratic family, but he gave up his earthly treasure to become a monk and live a life of poverty. He sold his fortune to build a monastery and serve the poor. At this very site, St. Gregory hosted a meal every day for a dozen poor men and served them himself from his own table. For Gregory, serving the poor was not as much an act of charity as it was a work of justice, in which we share the resources God has entrusted to us. He said, "When we attend to the needs of those in want, we give them what is theirs, not ours." When St. Gregory the Great served 12 poor men from his own table, he was imitating Jesus Christ. On the night before he died, Jesus humbly served his 12 apostles who sat with him at the table of the Last Supper. Jesus arose from the meal, poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet. This was the kind of task that a servant would do for his master. Yet Jesus, the divine Son of God, lowered himself to wash the feet of his own disciples, and he called his followers to do the same for others. In fact, Jesus was showing us that serving others is a key characteristic for what it means to be a disciple. Jesus said, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples." When we encounter Christ's love in our own lives, it changes us. It changes our hearts. We become more compassionate, and we desire to imitate Jesus Christ humbly and sacrificially serving those around us. In fact, this is what the Catholic Church's social teaching helps us to do, to love one another as Christ has loved us. There's this long tradition of Catholic social teaching being lived out in the Church for 2,000 years. Tell us a little bit about what the Church has done to embody Christ's message to serve.
That's the exact right question, Ted. Because before it was a teaching, it was action. The Church from her very beginning, the Church that's given us hospitals, for example, hospitals were a creation of the Catholic Church, is a church that from its very beginning was living love for their neighbor. You know, it's one of the great stories of early Christians that when plagues would come to cities, they're the ones who wouldn't leave. They'd stay with the sick and ailing. If you were rich and can get out of town, that's what you did in an early city. If a plague came, you ran to the hills, really. It's the Christians who stayed. They did that not because they got any benefit out of it, but simply because they loved God. You know, the early Christians were actually accused of using babies in sacrifices, because in the Roman period, people would leave their babies exposed out to die if they didn't want them, and the Christians would go and take care of them. And so people didn't even have a category for this. This is the Church living the love of God and then thinking about it. And that's become what we call the Catholic social tradition or teaching or doctrine. And the thing we need to always remember is they go hand in hand. You live love and you think about love, and this is how we create a world that people can flourish in.
How does this great tradition on Catholic social teaching impact our lives today?
Well, I think the question would be, what doesn't it impact? You know, right now in America, there are 47 million people living under the poverty line. It's the largest number we've ever seen since we've kept the statistic. The vast majority of human beings live on dollars a week throughout the world. We've had over 50 million babies who have been victims to abortion in our country. We stare at these questions and we say to ourselves, what can we do? What can we do? The church has been thinking about these things forever. Is there any hope of somehow answering these questions? And that's where Catholic social teaching comes to help us, because there are ways to think about these things that are consistent and valuable and helpful, and can help us find our place in these challenges that cause us sorrow, but sometimes we just don't know what to do about them.
Now, why would the Catholic social teaching be particularly important for our modern culture today?
You know, I think it's always been important, and I think sometimes we want to just be clear that as soon as the gospel came and taught us how to live, questions like, well, how do we organize our lives and how do we treat poor people, all those immediately came up. But in the last 150 years, we've seen some dramatic changes in the world, from the way we work to technology to the way states and politics work and democracy. And so it's actually raised a number of questions that hadn't been raised in the way they had in the previous hundreds and hundreds of years. So right now, there's particular challenges to the Christian life and particular opportunities to really help life more and more mirror the image of the gospel and the goals of the gospel that open up all kinds of opportunities for us. I mean, one of the things you'll hear about Catholic social teaching that people miss is there's a lot that critiques things, that worries about, well, we're doing this wrong or we're that wrong or we're not treating human life well. We don't take care of the poor well enough, or we do. But there's a lot that's positive. We have opportunities to help people in ways that we've never imagined. We can actually get food to people in ways that we never imagined, just as an example. So the opportunities are immense and the challenges are immense.
What are some of the challenges that we face today trying to live out the Church's teachings on these issues?
I'd say the biggest one of the biggest at least, is that we tend to in the modern world think of ourselves as autonomous individuals. It's a big word, but all it means is basically we treat life like, what's in it for me? What do I want? What will make me happy? And if I get that, if I have a right to that, then that's all that matters. And I think we've really lost a piece of the Catholic social thinking, which is responsibility. So I may have money, for example, or property, but that's a gift from God. It's not just for me. I actually have a responsibility to see to it that if my neighbor doesn't have enough, that I share that. And I don't think we talk enough about responsibility in the modern world.
I think that's really helpful, because many times we could think of these teachings from the Church in the economic, political, social, moral world as about issues out there, you know, globalization, immigration. Those are big
Right.
issues, but they don't directly impact my life. What would you say to people about how Catholic social teaching is a part of your very daily life?
I think the biggest thing we want to say to people is that Catholic social teaching starts with a person's life, that it starts with our own virtue and our own understanding of what it is to be a human being made in the image and likeness of God. It isn't all about finding global or social or political solutions to problems. If you don't have people who fundamentally themselves understand justice in their own life and with their families and with their neighbors, the notion that somehow you can tweak a system or make a law or change a policy is somehow going to fix these things is just mythical. And so it's always begun with the individual, the person's encounter with Jesus Christ. And so that's us. And it's not enough just to say I'm a good person, we actually have to do it. So not only do we try and think like the Church, we try and act like the Church.
What would you encourage people to do if they want to really embody this gospel message in our lives today?
Well, you know, Mother Teresa used to always say, charity and justice start in the home. It's often hardest to love the people who we're closest to and to treat them justly and to be generous with them. You know, one of the elements that the Pope Benedict XVI has added to some of this conversation, which I think is really nice, is he's talked about how all of Catholic social teaching comes from being grateful. We realize everything we've got is a gift. if we're willing to share everything we have with just the people next to us, we're living Catholic social teaching. Not as fully or as much as we could, but we started. The other thing is, and this is just from Mother Teresa, which is we need to encounter people who need us. We need to encounter the poor. We need to encounter the elderly. We need to encounter women wrestling with the challenge of an unexpected pregnancy. We need to encounter other human beings. Somehow, somewhere, we need to touch these problems in a human being if we're really going to live them. That's how they come alive.
Now, earlier you said, we should live this out with the people right around us. Give me some examples, practically, maybe in your own life or just where we encounter that every day.
If you're a family person, you got kids, the first place you start is, do I come home from work or come home from the office? First inclination is, I'm here to give. I've been given so much, I give back. So do I put them first? Do I serve them first? Do I treat greeting my children more important than getting my stuff set down and getting organized? Have I spent the time in the car on the way home thinking I'm going to bring Christ to my family when I get home? When I get home, I want my kids to look at me and I want them to somehow, somewhere think, in a way, Jesus just entered my house. And not the grumpy dad who's too tired to be home and who's exhausted, which occasionally happens in my own household. This is where we serve. There are so many opportunities for generosity in speech, in action, in service. If we're putting other people first, then the capability, we're able to live Catholic social teaching.
What would be a broad outline of the areas where Catholic social teaching impacts human life?
Well, I think we could just make a long litany, but I think maybe one of the things we'd want to say just first is, in our daily life, the most important, lasting things we encounter every day are those human beings around us who we talk to, play with, work with, sometimes insult and blow off, sometimes be very kind to. That's the only immortal thing we encounter all day. Everything else is secondary. Political systems, our work, our technology, whether we're staring at our iPad or whatever, that's all secondary. The only thing that's going to last forever that we encounter is another human being. And that's the fundamental truth, and that's where it all starts. All Catholic social teaching starts there. So if we can just begin with that and say that if I just lived as though the person I encountered is simply, and whether it was accidental, at the store, anywhere, is the single most important reality in the universe right now, besides God, then I get to the essence of what Catholic social teaching is. So then questions of the impact of economic systems on people who are living in towns next to mines in Peru, which is a question that's big right now in Latin America, or the question of what's fair labor laws, what is a good way to treat workers, and how should they be allowed to organize, or the question of what's a good policy around school choice, or how do we recognize that life issues are justice issues, and how do we implement that in law or policy? If we understand that at the heart of all this is that human being or these human beings, we get the core. And then the issues are almost never ending. They're anything that touches human beings coming together. I mean, that's what we are. We're human beings meant to be with one another. We've got to figure out how to live together in a way that honors the gospel.
One last question. What would you've mentioned issues related to human life. That would be the questions about abortion, bioethical issues, euthanasia, and you've also talked a lot about social justice issues. Are those two different worlds, or are they meant to be close together? How do they relate?
Well, in the teaching, they're right next to each other. There is no divide. An unborn child, there's a question of rights, and there's a question of human responsibility that is the same question for all social justice issues. So there's no separating them in thought. I think today they tend to get divided because they ended up on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And one of the things we just want to say is, let's not let politics determine our conversation. As Catholics, we actually have a way to view all these, and they go together. There's no separating life from justice issues. They're both justice issues. They're both about human beings and what constitutes or what makes for a great life, and what makes for people to be able to be everything God wants them to be. The whole social teaching of the Church is reducible to a simple phrase. I mean, this is a lot of different phrases, but one is, we want to create a society where people have the best chance and the opportunity to be everything God wants them to be.
We've seen how the Church's social teaching helps us to build a civilization of love, a society in which people can flourish. It helps us to live out what Jesus called us to do, and that is to love one another as He loved us. But the world is so big and there's so much suffering, so many problems. Some of us may wonder, what can I possibly do to help? We saw in today's session that Blessed Mother Teresa of Calcutta offers us some great advice. She once said, "Never worry about the numbers. Help one person at a time and always start with the person nearest you." Before we continue our look at how Catholic social teaching impacts the public sphere, its social, political, and economic implications, let's take time now to remember how Catholic social teaching begins right here, with each individual, in our own day-to-day lives with the people right around us. We don't have to go far to find poverty and those in need. In fact, some of the greatest poverty in the world is right around us if we have the eyes to see. It may not always be material poverty. It can also be what Pope Francis has called a poverty of relationships, or what Mother Teresa has described as a hunger for love. Let's take time now to prayerfully reflect about the people God has placed in our lives. Do we know someone who right now is hungering for love, someone who needs our care and attention? Maybe it's a coworker or somebody from our parish who's going through a difficult time. Do we know what's really going on in their lives? Do we share in their joys and their sufferings, their hopes and their fears? Or maybe it's something going on with one of our children. Do we give the best of ourselves to our kids and their needs? Or maybe it's something happening with our spouse. Do we know what's really weighing on the heart of our beloved? In all these cases, let's consider how we can give Christ's love to them more, so that we may wash their feet and love them as Christ has loved us.